October 12, 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was on vacation in Pitsunda, a government villa on the Black Sea shore on the Georgian coast. He was 70 years old and had spent the last 11 leading the Soviet Union, the largest state in the world, the second nuclear power on the planet. That day, he received a phone call from Moscow that it was Mikhail Suslov, the party's ideological guardian, one of the most respected and most feared men in the Kremlin. The message was brief. The Presidium of the Central Committee required his presence in Moscow urgently. The matter, Suslov explained, was the crisis in the agricultural sector. It was a lie out of precise lie, calculated, designed by men who had been conspiring for months to overthrow the leader of the Soviet state, and who knew exactly how much time they had before Khrushchev realized what was happening. When Khrushchev hung up the phone, he was sitting with his son Sergei and his friend and confidant Anastas Mikoyan, who held the post of president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. According to the testimony Sergei Khrushchev would give decades later, his father hesitated, remained silent for a moment, and then said, "It seems this is about something more than agriculture." He was right. And he got on the plane anyway. What happened in the 48 hours that followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of the Soviet Union. The first and only time a Soviet state leader was removed without being executed, without being sent to the Gulag, without violence of any kind. A coup carried out with meeting minutes, presidium votes, and Central Committee decrees. This is the story of how the men Khrushchev had chosen, promoted, and trusted conspired for months to take power from him, of why they did it, of how they came to believe they could do it without risking the fates that had befallen political opponents in the Soviet Union of earlier decades, and of how Khrushchev, the man who had survived Stalinism, defeated his rivals in 1957 and steered the Soviet Union through the Cuban Missile Crisis, ended his days in a Moscow apartment dictating his memoirs in secret, ignored by the state he had once directed. To understand why the Politburo decided to overthrow Khrushchev in the autumn of 1964. You need to understand who Khrushchev was and what he had done during his 11 years in power. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was born in 1894 in Kalinovka, a small village in Kursk province, in a family of peasants and miners. He was the kind of man the Soviet system should not have produced at its apex. Rustic in his manners, impulsive in his declarations, without the formal education that distinguished the apparatus's technocrats. But he had an extraordinary political intelligence and an energy that left those around him exhausted. He had survived Stalin's purges precisely because he knew when to fall silent, when to be visible, and when to disappear. And when Stalin died in March 1953, Khrushchev was the man who most quickly understood that the transition that followed could be the opportunity of his life. In the period immediately following Stalin's death, the Soviet Union lived through a complex and dangerous power struggle involving Beria, Malenkov, Molotov, Bulganin, and Khrushchev himself. By 1955, Khrushchev had emerged as the dominant man, holding the post of first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But it was February 25, 1956, when he did what no one had expected. He addressed the 20th Congress of the Communist Party and delivered what history would remember as the secret speech. For 4 hours before the delegates of the Congress, Khrushchev denounced Stalin. He described the crimes of the purges, the terror of the 1930s and 1940s, the torture methods used to extract false confessions, the executions of innocent people, the cult of personality that had converted a mortal man into an untouchable demigod. That it was the most radical denunciation any Soviet leader had ever delivered about the system's own recent past. The secret speech produced an earthquake. In Poland and Hungary, where news of the speech filtered quickly, it generated popular uprisings. In the Soviet Union, it launched the process known as de-Stalinization, the rehabilitation of some purge victims, the release of Gulag prisoners, a cultural opening known as the Khrushchev Thaw that allowed previously censored literary works to circulate for the first time. It was also the act that most damaged Khrushchev within the system. Not because his Presidium colleagues necessarily disapproved of the reforms, but because the secret speech and the policies that followed created instability and unpredictability. The system those men knew, the one within which they had built their careers, was a system of rigid certainties. Khrushchev was moving it at a speed none of them could fully control. In June 1957, a group of Presidium members, including Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich, attempted to remove him from his post by majority vote. Khrushchev responded with a brilliant maneuver. He convened the full Central Committee, a body of several hundred people, including party secretaries from every region of the country, and obtained from it the backing the Presidium was denying him. The anti-Khrushchev group was defeated, and its members expelled with the label of anti-party group. Kaganovich called him by telephone to beg that he not send him to be shot. Khrushchev replied that those times were behind them. It was the clearest demonstration that something fundamental had changed in Soviet politics. That physical elimination was no longer the automatic mechanism for resolving political conflicts in the Kremlin. It was also, though Khrushchev could not know it, the precedent his own rivals would use 7 years later to take power from him. Because what the 1964 conspirators learned from a 1957 episode was that the mechanism of institutional removal was possible, and that if in 1957 it had failed because those who attempted it did not control the Central Committee, in 1964 it could succeed if they ensured they controlled both the Presidium and the Central Committee before acting to understand the accumulation of grievances that led Presidium members to conspire against Khrushchev. You need to survey the final years of his governance. His agricultural policy was perhaps the area where ambition most clearly outpaced results. He had launched the Virgin Lands Campaign, a massive program to cultivate the steppes of Kazakhstan and Western Siberia, which had produced initially promising results, but by the mid-1960s was demonstrating its limits. Soil erosion, dependence on weather conditions, impossible to control. The collective system's inability to produce the yields that Western agricultural technology generated with far less land. Khrushchev had promised at the 20th Congress that the Soviet Union would surpass the United States in agricultural production within a few years. In 1963, the reality was that the Soviet Union had to purchase grain from capitalist countries to feed its own population. It was a political and economic humiliation his Presidium colleagues did not forget. Agricultural production was not the only problem. The economic reforms Khrushchev had implemented created constant uncertainty in the apparatus. In 1957, he created the Sovnarkozy, regional economic councils that decentralized industrial management. In 1962, he divided the Communist Party into agricultural and industrial sections, breaking the single-party structure that controlled every area of activity. The constant administrative reorganizations followed no obvious logic for those who had to implement them, and created in party cadres a sense of permanent instability. But perhaps the episode that most damaged Khrushchev's authority within the system was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. In September 1962, Khrushchev had authorized the secret deployment of medium-range nuclear missiles to Cuba, calculating it would be a maneuver that would shift the strategic balance with the United States and protect Cuba from a possible American invasion. The operation, discovered by American aerial intelligence, triggered 13 days of tension that brought the world closer to nuclear conflict than at any other moment in the Cold War. The resolution of the crisis, in which Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for the American promise not to invade Cuba, and the discreet withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey, was presented in the Soviet press as a diplomatic triumph. But within the Presidium, the assessment was different. It had been an enormous risk wager that had exposed the Soviet Union to international humiliation. It had generated a crisis of confidence with Mao Zedong's China, and it had demonstrated that Khrushchev was capable of taking strategic decisions of the highest consequence without adequately consulting his colleagues. Adding to this was Khrushchev's personal style, which as the 1960s advanced had become increasingly difficult to tolerate. He interrupted his interlocutors. He publicly mocked his colleagues at meetings and ceremonies. He imposed his opinions with a vehemence that left no room for real debate. Meeting notes from the Presidium that eventually reached historians show a pattern. Khrushchev dominated discussions, often arriving with decisions already made that he presented for ratification rather than debate, and reacting to criticism with a defensiveness that closed conversation rather than opening it. Brezhnev, was the man Khrushchev had chosen and promoted. He considered him a reliable and loyal ally. He had named him president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet in 1960, a post that was in practice nearly ceremonial, but which kept Brezhnev in the front line of Soviet protocol. In 1963, he had promoted him back to the Central Committee Secretariat, the position for which Brezhnev would coordinate much of the conspiracy that would bring him down. The paradox is almost perfect. The man Khrushchev trusted most was the one most actively organizing his fall. Plans to remove Khrushchev began taking concrete form in the spring of 1964. Historians who have studied the period identify two circles of conspirators who operated in a coordinated but somewhat independent manner. The first circle was Brezhnev's, which included Nikolai Podgorny, Central Committee Secretary for Ukraine, and Alexander Shelepin, a party apparatus official with significant connections in the KGB. The second circle included Shelepin himself and Vladimir Semichastny, head of the KGB, a Shelepin man who controlled the state's security and intelligence apparatus. Semichastny's participation was crucial. A KGB chief conspiring against the state leader was a situation that in Stalin's time would have ended immediately and definitively for the KGB chief. The fact that Semichastny actively participated in the conspiracy was possible because he, like the other conspirators, had reached the conclusion that the new Soviet political system, the one Khrushchev had shaped through de-Stalinization, did not necessarily imply the physical elimination of the political loser. Also fundamental was the attitude of Mikhail Suslov. Suslov was the guardian of the party's ideological orthodoxy, a man whose influence depended on maintaining the doctrinal stability Khrushchev constantly disturbed. Suslov was informed of the conspiracy relatively late in the process and decided not to block it. And when the moment came, he would chair the Presidium sessions where the accusations against Khrushchev were presented. The element that made the conspiracy especially risky was that they also needed control of the Central Committee, the very body that had saved Khrushchev in 1957. This time, the conspirators worked systematically to ensure that the party's regional secretaries were, if not actively on their side, at least neutralized or informed too late to react. In the final days of September 1964, Khrushchev traveled to Pitsunda. His son, Sergei, went with him. Anastas Mikoyan was also in the area. With Khrushchev outside Moscow, the conspirators accelerated their preparations. Presidium meetings were held without him. Regional party secretaries were contacted and prepared for the Central Committee session that would be convened after the Presidium. The KGB apparatus under Semichastny ensured there were no leaks reaching Khrushchev and that communications were under control. There was an attempt to warn Khrushchev. A party apparatus official named Galyakov, who had learned of the plans through conversations with former Presidium member Nikolai Ignatov, spoke with Mikoyan's circle. Sergei Khrushchev was informed, but when he tried to transmit the warning to his father, he found that Khrushchev did not want to fully believe it. Then came the October 12th call from Suslov that Khrushchev's decision to board the plane and travel to Moscow, knowing or suspecting what awaited him, is one of the most studied moments in this story. He could have refused to return. He could have tried to fly to some republic capital where he had allies, but he chose not to. Historians attribute that choice to a combination of factors. The real exhaustion of a 70-year-old man, the conviction that active resistance could produce consequences that submission would avoid, and perhaps the understanding that the system he himself had built implied accepting the verdict of institutional mechanisms. Even when that verdict was his own removal, Khrushchev's plane landed in Moscow on the afternoon of October 12th. He was not received with the usual honors due an active leader. He was taken directly to the Kremlin. The Presidium meeting began on October 13th, 1964, and continued over the hours that followed. What occurred in that room was, from a political standpoint, something without precedent in Soviet history. One by one, the men Khrushchev had chosen, promoted, and worked alongside for years rose to present a list of charges against him. The charges were extensive and covered almost every area of Soviet policy over the preceding years. The failure of agriculture, which he had promised would surpass the United States, and which in 1963 had been forced to import grain. The Cuban adventure, which had brought the world to the edge of nuclear war with a decision taken without adequate consultation. The constant administrative reorganizations sowing confusion in the apparatus. The disrespectful treatment of Presidium and Central Committee members. The unipersonal command style contradicting the principles of collective leadership the party had proclaimed after Stalin. The division of the party into industrial and agricultural sections. Nepotism in appointing his son-in-law Alexei Adzubiai to positions of influence that it was an accusation that covered everything. Every Presidium member made a statement. The tone was political and administrative, not personal, not ideological. He was not accused of treason against the state or of crimes against the party. He was accused of incompetence, disorder, and conduct unsuitable for someone exercising the collective leadership of the state. The difference from Stalinist proceedings was total. In the 1930s and 1940s, the accusations had been of treason and espionage. Confessions had been extracted under pressure. The result had been the firing squad or the Gulag. Here, the accusations were of political errors in command style. No violence, no threat of violence that it was, for the first time in Soviet history, a political meeting that resembled, at least superficially, an accountability hearing. Khrushchev defended himself, though his arguments were few and his position did not improve. Only Mikoyan spoke in his favor, proposing he be kept in office with reduced powers. The proposal found no support that on October 13th, the Presidium voted to remove him from all his posts that on October 14th, the Central Committee was convened in emergency session. Suslov presented the report of accusations. The Central Committee approved the Presidium's decision. Khrushchev was removed as first secretary of the Communist Party and as chairman of the Council of Ministers. Leonid Brezhnev was designated first secretary of the Communist Party. Alexei Kosygin was designated chairman of the Council of Ministers. Khrushchev was transferred to an apartment in Moscow and a dacha outside the city. He was guaranteed a pension. He was informed he could lead a quiet, private life. And he was made to understand that any political or public activity he might attempt to pursue would not be welcomed. The next day, October 15th, 1964, Soviet newspapers published a brief official communique informing the public that Comrade Khrushchev had requested retirement for reasons of health and advanced age. The world knew Khrushchev had been removed, but the real reasons and the mechanisms of the removal would not be known in detail for decades. To understand why the October 1964 coup succeeded when a 1957 attempt had failed, you need to examine the differences between the two situations. In 1957, the anti-Khrushchev group acted from the Presidium, believing that body had sufficient authority to remove the first secretary. They did not control the Central Committee, the body of several hundred regional secretaries that was the party's real institutional foundation. Khrushchev used the Central Committee as a counterweight and won. The losers were demoted, but not executed or sent to the Gulag. That outcome was what changed the risk calculus for every actor who came after. The 1964 conspirators studied that precedent carefully. They understood that for the coup to work, they needed to control both organs, first the Presidium, then the Central Committee. And they worked for months to ensure that when the moment came, the majority in both was with them. Brezhnev had the additional advantage of having maintained a formally correct relationship with Khrushchev throughout those years. He had publicly challenged no decision. He was the most predictably loyal ally in appearance. The man who at public events praised a leader with an effusiveness Khrushchev took as evidence of genuine loyalty, it was the mask of professional deference, placed in service of ambition. Applied at the highest possible scale point, one of the most human aspects of this story is the psychology of Khrushchev in the hours following his formal removal. According to testimonies his son Sergei collected in his memoirs, published decades later, Khrushchev returned to his dacha after the meetings with a composure that was difficult to interpret. He expressed no visible fury. He did not publicly condemn his former colleagues. He sat in the garden and remained silent for a time. Then he said, "Well, they retired me. Perhaps I deserved it. Perhaps I didn't know how to handle things." It is a statement that can be interpreted in many ways, as the genuine resignation of someone who accepts his defeat faster than expected, as the real exhaustion of a 70-year-old man. or as the expression of someone who had understood that resistance was not a real option, and that the only dignified exit was to accept the outcome with an appearance of calm. The first months of retirement were the hardest. Khrushchev tried on several occasions to contact friends in the apparatus to speak about politics. Most did not answer his calls. Those who did responded with the cold courtesy of someone who knows that any contact with a former leader might be observed and recorded. He gradually found in the recording of his memoirs a way to channel that energy. He spoke into his recorder for hours, recalling episodes from the revolution, from the war, from his years in power. He knew he was being monitored, but the recorder was small and discreet, and the tapes could be hidden. The publication of Khrushchev Remembers in 1970 was his final political act. Not an act of explicit revenge against the men who had removed him, but the affirmation that his story existed, that his version of events deserved to be heard. The Kremlin responded exactly as expected, with a denial and the organized silence around his name that he died on September 11th, 1971, at 77 of a heart attack. His death was announced in 2 lines in Soviet newspapers. There was no state funeral, no official speech. He was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow in a private ceremony. The headstone marking his grave was sculpted by Ernst Neizvestny, the artist with whom he had had a famous and bitter public quarrel in 1962. Neizvestny designed a headstone that combines black and white marble in alternating blocks, representing the 2 faces of a man who was simultaneously the liberator from the Gulag and the perpetuator of an authoritarian system he never questioned at its foundations. It is one of the most precise symbols the 20th century produced about the ambiguity of power. What the story of the October 1964 Politburo coup reveals about the nature of the Soviet system is that the system Stalin had built was, in certain respects, more fragile than it appeared. A single change in the informal norms about the use of political violence had completely altered the dynamics of competition for power in the Kremlin. That Khrushchev's de-Stalinization had unintentionally produced the conditions that made his own non-violent removal possible. The man who denounced Stalin's cult of personality was accused of building his own. The man who freed Gulag prisoners was removed in part because his colleagues feared a new accumulation of unipersonal power. The man who did most to make Soviet politics more humane became a victim of the most human mechanisms of that politics. The votes, the debates, the majorities. Tell us in the comments. Do you believe Khrushchev was a reformer who went too far, too fast, or was he simply betrayed by the very men he had promoted himself? This is the story of the only Soviet leader removed while still alive, without a bullet and without a cell, brought down by the men he trusted, using the institutional weapons he himself had built. The story of a phone call from the one man in the Kremlin he had no reason to suspect. Of a garden in Pitsunda where a 70-year-old man sat in silence and understood, in a sentence, what had happened to him. Of a headstone carved by an artist he once publicly humiliated, in black and white, alternating, neither pure. The story of a man who changed the system enough to survive it differently, but not enough to survive the men it had already shaped. If this story reached you, if it made you feel the full weight of what it cost to reshape a system of absolute power and still be consumed by it, then you already understand why the fall of power exists. This channel was built for exactly these stories. The ones where loyalty is the most carefully maintained performance until the exact moment it no longer needs to be. The ones where the reformer is brought down by the very precedent his reform created. The ones where the headstone tells the whole story in 2 colors and neither one wins. Subscribe to The Fall of Power right now. Leave a like if this story deserved to be told in full. Share it with someone who thinks Khrushchev was simply outmaneuvered by Brezhnev. And drop your answer to today's question in the comments. Because the debate over whether Khrushchev was a genuine reformer stopped by his own colleagues or an impulsive leader who brought his downfall on himself is one historians have been having since 1964. Activate the notification bell. Because the next file is already open, and what it reveals will make you question everything you thought you knew about what it takes to change a system of power from within, and what that system does to the people who try. The archive does not close.